Hey, what's up, gang? We're here with another commentary video. This time on Jordan Peterson doesn't understand Nazism. I think that was one of my earlier videos that got a lot of views, which is shocking to me since when I listen to videos from this time period or when I just started out, it's very painful for me. Just like the insecurity in the voice and the accent is even thicker than it is now. But what are you gonna do? I did my best. Yeah, it's one of the more controversial ones. 6,000 downvotes right now. But I like it. I mean, there are some things that I kind of regret in that video, but we're gonna go over that. So, Jordan Peterson, of course. I think right now, yesterday I read a headline of him being in Hungary, talking to Viktor Orban about the dangers of political correctness and illegal immigration, which, yeah, that's pretty fitting. I mean, in case you're not involved as I'm currently in European politics, Hungary is doing its best to lob as a third-tier Axis power right now. So yeah, I think that's why he fits there pretty good right now. Yeah, I guess let's just start, and I'll stop when there's something I have to say something about.
Hello everyone. Today I want to expand on something I hinted at in a previous video of mine and address the lobster in the room, Dr. Jordan Peterson. Most people on YouTube probably know who he is by now, but in case you don't, I will give you a short overview. Jordan Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and rose to stardom not that long ago by misrepresenting the Act to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and Criminal Code, also known as Bill C-16. For this
a lot of people were very pissed off at me just saying, oh, he misrepresented the bill, without going deeper into that, saying, how did Jordan Peterson misrepresent C-16? Don't you know that you get thrown into the gulag if you accidentally misgender someone? I mean, in case you don't know, C-16 basically just included misgendering in a harassing manner by employees and landlords under the normal discrimination laws. That's pretty much all it did, and I'm pretty okay with that. And it's so fascinating to me that Bill 16 is what Jordan Peterson kind of built his career on. That was his jumping block, fear-mongering about free speech on campus, etc. And now nothing has come of C-16. Nobody has been thrown in jail, as far as I know, and everyone just kind of seems to forget that this guy that this was a total hoax, and there was really nothing to it, and this guy just pretty much made it up. But it it doesn't seem to hurt his career in any way, which is fascinating to me. But
was rewarded with a lot of attention and since then has been fetishized as some kind of free speech martyr for standing up to the Canadian government, who wanted to open the gulags to people accidentally misgendering a person.
If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that.
With
very normal person.
His recent best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, he's also become the savior of disaffected young males with messy rooms.
I can't seem to escape this book. Of course, it's sold in German bookstores. I've seen it here repeatedly. And last year, over New Year's Eve, I was in Norway, and we were in a restaurant, and I was sitting there with some friends, and the guy next to me just opens his backpack and gets out the guy at the table next to us, opens his backpack and pulls his book out, 12 Rules for Life, and starts telling his girlfriend what an awesome person Jordan Peterson is, and she just sits there kind of confused.
His main work, however, are his lectures, all of which can be found online and have now also gathered a significant fan base. There's one thing that stands out when talking about Jordan Peterson's fan base, and that sometimes earns him some uncomfortable questions.
Maximoff says, thoughts on the Jews? Thoughts on the Jews? Well, the first thing I could say about Jews is that a lot of my friends happen to be Jewish, and okay, all right, what the hell? Address the Jewish question. That's
what a weird coincidence.
a hell of a thing
I don't get these questions.
to ask.
Could Jewish individuals use their position of power to seek out revenge against places like Europe and Russia that have a history of expelling Jews.
Hold it.
Namely that he seems to attract a lot of people from the fringes of the right, although he is very opposed to the political views of said fringes.
Not really,
His,
though.
let's say, more moderate fan base seems to have no answer for why that is, and often claims that if anything, Peterson has a moderating effect on people with extremist views, pulling them more to the center. There is a very popular clip making the rounds, which has gathered around 2.3...
Man, I'm way too close to the microphone. Like, you hear the saliva-drenched voice in this recording so much. I'm sorry, everyone.
3 million views by now, and is titled How Hitler Was Even More Evil Than You Think. Although I would assume Peterson would probably object to this title because his big thing is that given the right circumstances, anyone can be a Nazi prison guard.
He isn't. He is not opposed to that categorization, because I heard him since repeatedly say like how evil Hitler was, which, I mean, Jordan Peterson's big thing about the Nazis is like trying to explain why people end up that way, which doesn't mix well with moral condemnation. If you understand what I'm saying. Of course these are evil. Of course these people are evil, but you can't really mix that. Like, you have to separate like the moral condemnation of what these people did to how they become this way. No? Okay.
A very revolutionary idea, by the way, that people are shaped by their surroundings. Anyway, the clip...
A lot of people didn't get that this was sarcasm and demanded that I explain what I mean by that. Like, that's a very revolutionary idea. Of course that's sarcasm. I mean, we'll get into this later, but the idea that everyone would have been a Nazi mostly started surfacing in the early 90s with a book called Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. But we'll get to that in a minute. That was just like me being an asshole.
The clip is taken from a longer lecture called Maps of Meaning 11, The Flood and the Tower, which I will leave in the description so you can make sure I'm not taking him out of context. In this lecture, he tackles the Nazis' motivation for the Holocaust and gives his own perspective on the matter. It is unfortunate that, as with so many things he says, his own lack of knowledge leads to his points being garbled at best and wrong at worst. Not only is he completely wrong historically speaking and puts into question if his knowledge of Nazi ideology exceeds Hitler's table talk and Ordinary Men, but the way he frames Hitler's or the Nazis' motivations showcases why the far right finds him so appealing. He doesn't make any excuses or portrays them positively in any way, but what his take and his other work implies fits very well with what the far right thinks. So we'll look at how he is wrong from a historical perspective and why his conclusion is actually dangerous. Let's listen to the clip, shall we?
So here's what you should have done if you were a Nazi and you wanted to win the war. You should have enslaved the Jews and the Gypsies and had them work, right? You should have had them work for the benefit of the victory, and then if you wanted to, you liquidate them afterwards. That's the logical thing to do if you want to win. And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. But that's not a very intelligent assumption. Why would you assume that?
This is so bad.
He wasn't exactly a good guy. So why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms, right? The glorious, everlasting Third Reich. So what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place. Because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time.
There's a whole lot to unpack just within this short statement.
Yeah, I'm kind of unhappy with this little part saying, oh, he slipped up and said Fourth Reich or whatever. It's kind of unnecessary. But like, here's the main mistake that Jordan Peterson makes in his assumptions on the Nazis' motivations and why they didn't just enslave them, but also killed a lot of minorities. Jordan Peterson, and I guess this is the case with most people, he sees World War II and then he sees the Holocaust, and he sees them as like different things, as different goals of the Nazis. You know, there's a military conflict against the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain, and then there is the Holocaust and the ambition to exterminate the European Jews. And on the surface, it seems illogical that while the Eastern Front is collapsing, you would accelerate the extermination in Auschwitz and other places. It's not really, though, because he uses, like, he's confused because he uses our logic by today, but that's not the paradigm the Nazis operated under. The Holocaust and World War II for them were very much the same thing. Like, the war isn't against the United States, it's not against the Soviet Union, it's against international Jewry. And I mean, I go on to explain this in the video, but I think maybe me and the person who co-wrote the script didn't do an amazing job at this, because a lot of people seem confused by what Jordan Peterson's main problem is in this video. Yeah, okay, let's move on.
There is the fact that Peterson doesn't seem really sure if it's the Nazis' Third or the imagined by neo-Nazis Fourth Reich he's talking about.
Yeah, that's pretty petty, but...
There is the issue that calling the Roma, Sinti and others persecuted under the label gypsies, a term which reproduces questionable language used by the perpetrators of the Holocaust. But the foremost problem is that Peterson doesn't seem to take his own advice seriously.
Now, you know, you have to use that dictum carefully.
Later in the video, he cites Jung, of course, to make the point that sometimes in order to infer the motivations for an action, one needs to look at the outcome of an action.
You can suspend your unnecessary demolition of people, win the damn war, and then pick it up afterwards. Or while you're losing, you can just accelerate the mayhem even though it's counterproductive. It's like, what'd they pick? Well, they picked to accelerate the mayhem.
Here again, like, it's counterproductive operating from the viewpoint of Jordan Peterson but from the viewpoint of the Nazis, it was the same thing. Like, it's really no accident that, like, what we today understand as the Holocaust, like the state-sponsored genocide of Jews in Roma, really started kicking into gears with the attack on the Soviet Union, because it, like, connected the fear of communism, like the enemy from outside, with the fear of Jews, the perceived enemy on the inside.
And so to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation.
That's not really what historians investigating the Nazis and the Third Reich, or any period for that matter, do.
And the reason for that is because we can just look up why they did it. Like, it's not a big mystery. And Michael Brooks of the Majority Report said this a while ago in an interview, and of course that's a generalization, but for this clip it makes perfect sense. He said that in general, like, the right uses mythology to explain the world and the left kind of uses history. Of course, it's like painting in broad strokes, but for this video it fits perfectly, because Jordan Peterson sits there and thinks, why did they, like, accelerate the mayhem even though they were losing World War II? That doesn't make sense to me, so I'm gonna use, like, my weird Jungian drivel and say, oh, okay, if you can't figure out what someone's doing, maybe infer the motivation, and that leads us to the Nazis just wanted to wreck shit, and that robs us of understanding the power behind these ideas that the German people succumb to. That's the main problem, you know. It's a pretty convenient way to explain this away, why this happened. And the reason why Jordan Peterson is so wrong on this is because this isn't in this video, but in the lecture he says it shortly before explaining this. He cites a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans and the Final Solution. I think it's what's called, from Daniel Goldhagen. And that book came out in the mid-90s and was insanely popular with, like, the average readership, but was generally panned by historians. And the reason for that is because Daniel Goldhagen tried to explain the Holocaust, why it happened, with what's usually called a Sonderweg thesis, or a special way in English. He tried to say that German culture and German society was so insanely anti-Semitic, not that this was bound to happen, but something like this had to happen, and that separated Germany from any other country in Europe, is what I mean. It's an entire book. I can't summarize it right now, but that's pretty much like his core idea. That it wasn't like a lot of historians believe like, oh, if there's no Hitler, there's no Holocaust. He didn't believe that. He thought like, oh, German society like is so anti-Semitic in German culture that this was bound to happen pretty much. And yeah, as I said, it's kind of panned by historians. You know, Germany wasn't even the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. Like even during World War I. In Russia, for instance, Jews weren't even allowed to be citizens at the time. And Daniel Goldhagen has also faced accusations of racism for this book, like racist Germanophobia, because he somewhat like treats, these aren't my words, this is a critic wrote this, treats like the German people in the same monolithic way that the Germans saw, that the Nazis saw the Jews, pretty much. And like ignores all deviations or nuances in the country at the time. Yeah, this is kind of the book that he bases this his knowledge off, and like, I mean, that's okay. You know, not everybody has the time to immerse himself in the Holocaust historiography. But if you're a professor talking about, I mean, this isn't a history lecture, but it kind of drifts off in that territory. Maybe like read another book after the 90s on this topic.
Not just because not every action might produce the outcome desired by the historical actor, but also because, and this is something where Peterson should probably have listened to some postmodern theorists if he had read them, presents the massive danger of projecting your own cultural and social assumptions and rationalities back onto historical actors who, due to difference in historically formed discourse, might operate under entirely different assumptions and rationalities. Case in point, Jordan Peterson asserts that in order to win the war, it would have been more beneficial to round up and enslave Jews and so-called gypsies rather than to kill them. This represents a fairly abhorrent application of capitalist logic of valorization and exploitation. Under the base assumptions our society and the society Jordan Peterson operates under, the mass enslavement and economic exploitation of millions of people—
Yeah, that's pretty much what I just said, so I'm just gonna keep going.
—represents an understandable, a logical policy. Leaving aside for now that the Nazis did exactly that in addition to mass murder, the problem begins when Peterson juxtaposes this supposedly fine logic with what he asserts the Nazis' real motive for their actions was: mayhem, and getting into the metaphysical Jungian drivel, the mark of Cain.
Or are we going to attribute to Hitler the highest possible motives? Say, no, it's an archetypal manifestation of Cain. Now, he's going to put up a front that says, well, I'm your savior. It's like, well, destructive people think that Cain is their savior.
This is such gibberish. Like, Jordan Peterson says he studied Nazism for 40 years, and then he comes up with these like metaphysical weird claims when you can just look up what happened. You know, it's, I mean, numerous historians have dedicated their entire lives to figuring this out. There's no need to apply like your Jungian psychology to this.
Reality is simpler yet more complicated at the same time. Rather than mayhem or any sort of metaphysical manifestation of evil, the Nazis are relatively straightforward in telling us their base assumptions upon which their actions and logic is based upon. It's not mayhem, but rather the idea that the prime objective is the removal, up to and including physical extermination, of Jews and so-called gypsies from the world. Winning the war for the Nazi leadership and the German state at the time means achieving that goal. War, German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz wrote, is the extension of politics by other means. This dictum is as true for the Nazis as it is for virtually every other war of the 19th and 20th century. Nazi politics and ideology is built around one core assumption about the nature of society, the state and history. That all of history, including all social formations, are built around
these real like in-depth parts about like Nazi ideology and stuff were all written by Commie Space Invader, who is amazing and a fantastic historian. Look him up on Ask Historians if you want to read more stuff like this. And an essay of his was the inspiration for the next video that I'm doing. But okay.
Biological conflict between races, with the most prominent actors on the stage being the German or Aryan race, which represents order, progress and civilization, and the alleged Jewish race, which represents chaos, decadence, decay and destruction.
This was a movie, by the way, like a documentary, The Eternal Jew, like showing how like all through history Jews behave the same way.
Since in the Nazi worldview all of history revolves around this conflict, so does necessarily the Second World War and the conception of what a German victory looks like in this conflict. Even with the war itself becoming an important catalyst in radicalizing German policy, from discrimination, forced immigration and ghettoization to actual physical extermination of Jews. In his book The Origins of the Final Solution, Christopher Browning writes about the important changes that came with the start of the war in 1939 that not only forced the Nazis to consider what they called the Jewish question in a framework beyond Germany, it also represented a qualitative change.
This is like the hardest word for me, like question. But I mean, it's gotten a lot easier, but back then it was even worse.
Germany was now at war. For some time, Nazi propaganda had branded the Jew as the enemy of Germany. If war came, it would be through the machinations of international Jewry. The Jew was an integral part, indeed the quintessence of the Nazi Feindbild, or stereotyped image of the enemy. Now that Germany was at war, harsh measures against the enemy, including potential enemies, non-combatant civilians, women, children, seemed self-evident and justified by national interest. We don't even have to look far.
This is pretty much like Christopher Browning's thesis on why like ordinary people were able to do this stuff in his book Ordinary Men that he wrote, I think in 92, or published in 92, where he said like most people who took, I mean, the Holocaust isn't just like the gas chambers, it was a big part of it were mass executions, and the people who did that weren't necessarily just turned into like vicious beasts by Nazi ideology, but were much more pressed by things like peer pressure and this sense of like a national emergency, you know, like you defending the nation and doing this.
To get this information straight from the horse's mouth. In a speech from January 13th, 1939, so more than half a year before the invasion of Poland, Hitler stated the following: "Today I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish finance..."
That picture isn't from that speech, by the way. This is from the famous picture where Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States.
Yes, in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war.
I was still using my freeware video editor here, which always like screwed up text like this. You can see like there's in this like row there's only the N and here's only the, and it's like kind of a fucked up format. But I moved on since then, luckily.
Then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Hitler would echo this prophecy several times in public, and after the US entered the conflict, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "Regarding the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to clean the table." He prophesied that should the Jews once again bring about a world war, they would be annihilated. These were no empty words. The world war has come, therefore the annihilation of the Jews has to be its inevitable consequence. The question has to be examined without any sentimentality. We are not here to pity Jews, but to have pity for our own German people. If the German people have sacrificed about 160,000 dead in the battles in the East, the instigators of this bloody conflict will have to pay for it with their lives. But the war did even more than that, since in the view of Hitler and the German leadership, it represented the Manichaean struggle between the German and the Jewish race. It both necessitated every conceivable measure and made more radical policy possible. It is no coincidence that the order by which the T4 killing program aimed at murdering handicapped and mentally ill individuals in German hospitals and asylums was backdated by Hitler to September 1st, 1939, the day of the invasion of Poland. The purification of Germany, starting with the centralized murder of these unnütze Esser or not useful eaters, represented a first and necessary step at purifying the German race in a struggle with international Jewry, as represented by France, the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union alike.
Yeah, you can see that pretty good in this. I mean, this picture as well. Like this essentially says like you carry these people. And that a person who gets born sick costs, by the time he or she is 60, on average like 50,000 Reichsmark, like the German currency, showing how what a burden they are to the state. I mean, what this is supposed to do. And this says like Jewish complot, showing Stalin and Churchill like shaking hands. Like kind of showing that what I just said, that the battle is not really against like Stalin and Churchill, it's against international Jewry, and who were seen as like the instigators of this.
Which leads to another important point. It is also no coincidence that what we today consider the Holocaust, meaning the systematic state-sponsored genocide of so-called Gypsies and Jews, started with the attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, in the form of the Nazi Einsatzgruppen starting to systematically shoot members of these groups behind the front line. The UN...
And you can still hear how unnatural it is for me to read these texts and record them, because there's often like this start-stop in the middle of a sentence. I'm glad it's gotten better since then.
USSR, in the view of the Nazi leadership, was the physical and material manifestation of the danger of Jewish Bolshevism. Communism, according to Hitler and the German leadership, represented the Jews' most potent weapon in their historic struggle with the Germans. The idea of Judeo-Bolshevism had spread like wildfire from the outset of the Russian Civil War in 1917 and had become an integral part of extreme right-wing ideology in Germany during the German revolutions of 1980.
This is such an awesome picture, like German revolutionaries in front of the Brandenburg Gate with the red flags.
18 and 1919. As Lorna Weddington writes in her book Hitler's Crusade, Bolshevism, the Jews and the Myth of Conspiracy, it was the juxtaposition of Asiatic Bolshevism with the Oriental...
That's kind of a weird book cover. I always thought, like these weird shots of Hitler.
Jew that provided the key to National Socialist perceptions of an elaborate Jewish conspiracy, of which Marxism, with its insistence on eminently Jewish values, internationalism, egalitarianism and pacifism, so antithetical to the Völkisch ideal, was a key component. In short, the war against the Soviet Union was inextricably linked to the war against international Jewry. In fact, in the view of the German leadership of the Third Reich, they were one and the same. This is evident in how this...
There have been some response videos done to this video in particular, and I haven't watched all of them, but I watched some of them, and they mostly like skip over all this. Oh, this is just like sophistry, blah blah blah, and then they skip to the end where I say, you know, the way that like Jordan Peterson presents his like ideological enemies, is somewhat reminiscent of this like monolithic treatment of how the Nazis saw their enemies. And that's equally dangerous, or not equally dangerous, but that is also dangerous. And they kind of skip to that and saying, the fucking left again, calling everyone they disagree with a Nazi.
War was planned and how the systematic murder of Jews in the Soviet Union was an integral element to its planning from the beginning. It was a war of extermination in which victory meant nothing short of the total physical and political annihilation of the Soviet Union, and especially its Jewish population. In his study of Wehrmacht generals on the Eastern Front, Hitler's Heerführer, historian Johannes Hürter shows how deeply ingrained this idea of the war against the Soviet Union being a war of extermination against international Jewry was among the Wehrmacht leadership as well. For instance, the writings of General Hermann Hoth, who during and after the war constantly emphasized these factors by writing, among other things, that Stalin's Soviet Union was a Bolshevist, Asiatic and Jewified state that spread like an oil spill, and like an oil spill needed to be contained. 1941 was the last possible point in time to stop the flood of Jewish Bolshevism at the borders of Europe. What all of this...
A lot of like German soldiers still think that to this day. There's a YouTube video where like some Wehrmacht soldiers are at a museum or somewhere and defend like the deportation, or say, oh, the Wehrmacht never deported anybody. And they say, oh yeah, like, we were fighting off like the threat of Bolshevism and shit like that.
Shows is that rather than some abstract form of mayhem, there was a concrete, discernible and explicit basic assumption about the world that dictated the Nazis' actions and logic of these actions. Victory in the war meant the annihilation of the Jews and so-called Gypsies. This was the idea that both the Holocaust and the very nature of the war, how it was planned, organized and executed, was centered around. This is the reason why the Einsatzgruppen started off the systematic murder of Jews and so-called Gypsies in the Soviet Union in 1941, why the death camps opened their doors in 1942, and why the German leadership started accelerating the program of genocide even in 1944. Because to them victory was impossible without genocide. It's also the reason why, based on this assumption, the Nazis did build a system that followed premises that Peterson calls logical and fine. The Nazis did enslave Jews and so-called Gypsies and force them to work in the German war machine. Millions of Jews and so-called Gypsies worked for the IG Farben in Auschwitz.
This is Auschwitz 3, like the third part of Auschwitz. Yeah.
built V-2 rocket sites and the rockets themselves, and manufactured goods for the Wehrmacht. Also, they expropriated assets from robbed art, houses and money to the sale of gold teeth, and even hair of murdered Jews netted the German Reich millions of Reichsmark that were invested in the war economy. Economist Zindai Zabludov writes that...
Well, I butchered that name. Anyway, yeah, that's another thing. Like, the perception that keeping someone alive would be economically better than just letting them die and take all their assets, pretty much. It's kind of confusing.
In late 1930s prices, the value of Jewish assets amounted to $10 to $15 billion. This estimate is based on a 1998 paper by this author. Its methodology draws on the pioneering efforts by Nehemiah Robinson in the 1940s and 1950s and other material. This includes estimates of the Jewish share of wealth for each country in Nazi-occupied Europe, tax records, country estimates published at the time, and the asset declarations that the Nazis forced the Jews to file.
Man, this video is so dry. I like to tell myself I've gotten better since then, but I'm not sure. But just like this reading of texts, like, kudos to you guys for making it through this.
In today's prices, today being 2005, the value of these Jewish assets would be some $143 to $215 billion. The Holocaust, which the Nazis very much organized as a for-profit venture, contributed to said capacity. While taking up very little resources and manpower, the camps financed themselves and generated surplus profit, and even the killing campaign was organized in a way that provided what the Nazis perceived as economic benefits. Nowhere is this more evident than when it comes to food policy. Historian Christian Gerlach details this in his book Krieg, Ernährung, Völkermord, when he writes that under the impressions of the German experiences of the First World War, it was an absolute priority of the German leadership to have the German populace fed. They succeeded in this, given that in the terms of calories, the German population was the second best fed one after the US Americans during the entire war.
The reason why they did this was that they were under the perception that a large part of why Germany lost World War I was just the home front. I mean, it was a big part, but it wasn't like, even with the home front doing fine, like the Balkan front would have still collapsed, the Americans would have still broken through, or the Entente force would have still broken through the Hindenburg Line. But they wanted to prevent things like the turn-up winter from happening, where in the winter from 1916 to 17, a bunch of people starved in Germany because of the British sea blockade. And they didn't want to risk like lowering morale at home because of missing food.
The way this was achieved ties in directly with the Holocaust and the program of economic exploitation. Not only did the Germans go as far as to cause a catastrophic famine in Greece, but one of the very motives why the extermination program sped up in 1942 with the Operation Reinhard death camp starting to operate in Poland was that the Nazis wanted to save food. You don't have to feed dead people, and to kill 1.9 million people you otherwise would have to feed, no matter how bad it allowed the Reich leadership to keep rations comparatively high for the German population. And here's where we get to what I called dangerous conclusions earlier. The reason this is so important and why Jordan Peterson
is kind of a bad transition, like going from like this in-depth Nazi policy stuff back to the original point I was trying to make.
Peterson's musings on Nazism are so objectionable is rather simple. By understanding that the Nazis' actions followed a rationality derived from their basic assumptions about the world, we are able to grasp the destructive force of racist and anti-Semitic ideology, of a conspiratorial worldview that is centered around the charge of a group wishing to destroy our values, our way of life.
That seems kind of familiar.
By simply ascribing the Nazis' actions to a wish to cause mayhem, to the mark of Cain, their actions are exterritorialized from history, excluded from the process of understanding them. If, as Peterson later posits in the video, the cruelties committed by the Nazi perpetrators are the result of evil or a psychopathology, they are excluded from any attempt to understand them as a manifestation of an ideology. We can never fully grasp psychopaths, and by pathologizing the perpetrators of the Nazi genocide, we reassure ourselves that we can never become them. But Nazism was not a pathology, and it was not just a wish to cause mayhem. Nazis were the result of a concrete worldview. A worldview not too dissimilar to that Jordan Peterson and other figures the far-right flocks to are trying to peddle today. If, like Peterson, people perceive the world in a way that posits certain behaviors, attitude and social positions of certain people as primordial, like...
I didn't get into this in this video, but it's also like this like hyper focus on anything the left does is bad, which is essentially what fascism is historically speaking. It's a movement against the left, and I think this is also why so many people who start out in this like IDW or let's trigger the feminist bullshit end up like being straight up neo-Nazis, because once you accept like this view of everything the left does is bad, it's much easier to shift further to the right.
For instance, Peterson claims in his book 12 Rules for Life in stating, culture is symbolically, archetypically, mythically male, chaos the unknown is symbolically associated with the feminine, and further asserts that there are certain groups that are...
Regarding this statement that he says, oh, you know, chaos is female, order is male, I think someone responded to that with a quote from that book saying, oh, but he also says in the book that chaos is necessary, like yin and yang, so it doesn't really fit your description. But the book is literally called An Antidote to Chaos, so I have a hard time believing that chaos isn't seen as a negative force in this book.
Male, chaos the unknown is symbolically associated with the feminine, and further asserts that there are certain groups that are trying to disrupt the natural order of things with a nefarious agenda.
And the second thing it's an assault on is everything that's been established since the Enlightenment. Rationality, empiricism, science, everything. Clarity of mind, dialogue.
Imagine like the worldview that this guy has, that like college students want to destroy the world because they adhere to philosophical concepts he doesn't like. It's so baffling that this guy gains so much traction. I mean, he's on Joe Rogan saying this.
The idea of the individual, all of that is not only, you see, it's not only that it's up for grabs. That's not the thing. It's to be destroyed. That's the goal.
Even going as far as to claim this supposed group isn't even interested in talking to you.
You see, and this is no aberration that these people don't engage in dialogue. It's no aberration. It's built right into the philosophical system. They regard the idea that if you're in one power group and I'm in another, the idea that we can step out of that group, engage in a dialogue, have our worlds meet, and produce some sort of
understanding of each other.
Yeah, some sort of negotiated understanding. No, that's part of your oppressive patriarchal game, that idea. That whole idea is part of your game. So if I even engage in the dialogue, I'm playing your game, you win.
Then conditions brought about by social change, political unrest, or even war can quickly lead to a political program that, like the Nazis, asserts that the only solution to this problem is for these groups not to live in this world anymore, and to use coercion to assert the natural state of things. That's it for today.
That was it. I don't even know from when this video is. Like, what were the videos like surrounding this? Let's see. Oh yeah, that was 1 year ago. Yeah, one of my earlier videos. Surprised it did so well, but probably mostly because it's about Jordan Peterson. Okay, yeah, so that was it for this video. I'm probably gonna ask you pretty soon which one you would like to see next, and there won't be as big a gap between the next one and this one compared to the last one. Okay, like, because now I have much more time to do this stuff, and yeah, just like let me know which you would want to see next, and yeah, I'll talk to you then. Have a good one. Bye.